For the first time this season, we've got two presenters. And when you look at the subject of the meeting, the Chalon head, you won't be too surprised that they've got an interest in New Zealand philately. And that's what's taken them to do this talk. John's the chairman of the New Zealand Society of Great Britain and a member of the Royal Council. And Brian Hart, who's joined us from California, has had a lifelong interest in New Zealand stamps. We had a particular opportunity to look at the portrait in detail about 18 months ago, and this research has come out of that opportunity the Royal had. So I'm going to hand over to Brian and John to take us through the Chalon portrait, an iconic philatelic item.
Simon, thank you. Fellows, members, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending this afternoon. I do hope you find this talk both interesting and educational. I believe it was John Cleese from Monty Python's Flying Circus who announced, and now it's time for something completely different. Well, this afternoon's presentation will be different. No stamps, no covers, but a lot about British and European history, all with relevance to the most important portrait known to philatelists the world over. The Chalon portrait of a young Queen Victoria in her robes of accession. Actually, on reflection, I think I do have one picture of a miniature sheet with at least one stamp on it. But you'll see this is not your usual Zoom presentation for the Royal. We'll see some where we normally see wonderful stamps and unique covers from members' collections on display. I'll start the screen show and main presentation in a minute, but I'd like to provide a little context for our research into the Chalon portrait. In March of 2022, I received a commission from Chris Harman and Peter Coburn, two past presidents of the Society. So who was I to turn down the opportunity? And the task was to raise funds for the acquisition of a Chalon portrait of Queen Victoria. The aim was to acquire the painting for the museum, the Spear Museum of Philatelic History at the Royal in Abchurch Lane, London. The portrait was being offered to us in a private sale. At the time, I was particularly motivated to do this. As the chair of the New Zealand Society of Great Britain, we were just about to celebrate our 70th anniversary with a display at the Royal, and many of you were probably at that meeting. And what could have been a better way to celebrate than to see a portrait of Queen Victoria hanging on the wall in the New Zealand room on the 4th floor of Abchurch Lane? Indeed, I'd still like to see this happen. But raising funds from members coming just after the Tomorrow's Royal campaign was going to be particularly difficult. So I approached the Art Fund and the Victoria and Albert Purchase Grant Fund. Now, both of these organisations here in the UK offer assistance in the acquisition of art for accredited museums. And we all know our museum in Abchurch Lane is accredited. So, sounded like a good idea. This support from those two funds would come in the form of a financial contribution towards the purchase, always very welcome, and probably more importantly to us at the time, professional assistance from an art historian and a valuer. Now, the conditions of the grant were that, of any grant indeed, were that the provenance of the portrait must be clear and a professional valuation had to have been carried out. The Art Fund coordinator directed me to the National Portrait Gallery here in London and Rupert Maas. He's a renowned art historian and valuer. He also has his own gallery, portrait gallery in St. James in London. Now, it was their combined opinion that the provenance of the portrait that was being offered to us at the Royal was insufficient for them to make a donation from either of these two grants. A shame, but undeterred, I set out to understand for myself a little bit about the history behind the Chalon portrait and to try and uncover some of the provenance that was lacking for this particular painting. Literally within a few seconds of starting the initial research, I found my way on my computer to Brian Hart's blog on the internet. Brian's my co-presenter today, and it was that contact and the ensuing friendship that instigated the research and the discoveries that we're going to present today. So we were faced with this question, the Chalon portrait. Our fundamental question was, how many portraits were painted by Chalon himself? And if there was more than one, were they all of equal importance? So I do have a caveat here. I'll gloss over this chart. Suffice to say that Brian and I are enthusiastic amateur sleuths. We've tried not to draw our own conclusions or provide opinions on our findings, preferring to quote sources and reference historical documents that have undoubted provenance. The question about whether there was 1, 2, or 3 portraits was posed really by Robson Lowe, who stated in several documents which have been reproduced that there were 3 copies. He introduced a sketch and 3 copies. The inference here was that all were produced by Chalon himself as a commission by the young Queen Victoria, one to give to her mother and the other 2 as gifts to the heads of the European families, namely the King of Prussia and the King of Portugal. The portrait Queen Victoria gave to her mother as a birthday present eventually has come to reside with the Belgian royal family. So from here on in this presentation, we refer to there being 3 Chalon portraits, one as the British or Belgian portrait, the second the Portuguese Chalon, and the third the Prussian Chalon. Now here you see 3 artifacts side by side. The portrait, the image on the left, is Chalon's original sketch, apparently done in watercolour on paper. The image is shown here courtesy of Ian Gregg, who saw the sketch at Harmer's in London and had the good fortune to take a picture. The whereabouts of the sketch today are unknown. The image in the centre is that of the original portrait given by Queen Victoria to her mother as a birthday present. Again, this portrait is in watercolour, done on paper or parchment. The portrait resides in an apartment belonging to the royal family in Belgium, in Brussels. Its provenance is without doubt. It's signed by Chalon as portrait painter in watercolours to Her Majesty, his official title. The image on the right is the Portuguese Chalon, once owned by Robson Lowe, and this is the portrait that was being offered to the royal. This portrait is painted on porcelain. Images of this portrait have been reproduced in many works, including Bob Oden-Weller's book on the Chalon stamps. It was also used by the New Zealand Post Office as the basis of the 1988 miniature sheet, celebrating the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Royal Philatelic Society of New Zealand. Over to Brian now to introduce some of the historical timeline and the events that led up to the commission Chalon received to paint Queen Victoria.
Thanks, John. So since we'll have several intertwined threads, to help you, we've added miniatures of the individuals involved and placed them in a vertical timeline. As well, the text is color-coded. Black means Chalon or the British-Belgian Chalon. Blue is for Victoria and red is for the Portuguese thread. So in the beginning, we have the Chalon family in Geneva. 2 sons are born, the elder John, and then now Alfred Edward. The family, parents, sons, and a daughter, moved to England where their father switches from watchmaker to professor of French. Both sons start in trade, but it doesn't work out for them, and very quickly they pivot to art. First John, then Alfred join the Royal Academy schools. It turns out that younger brother Alfred is more successful. He becomes an associate of the Royal Academy, then a Royal Academician before his brother. And this explains the RA in his signature that we'll see next. Then, after all this, Victoria is born. And then when we fast forward to London in the 1830s, Alfred Chalon, now in his 50s and still living with his parents and siblings, was a famous and fashionable watercolor painter, especially of ladies in flowing silks and airy laces. We see an example of this watercolor at bottom right, and some of his earlier work in oils we see at top right. A lot happened in 1837. From Victoria's journal, an artist, Lane, mentions Chalon to Victoria and espouses how quickly Chalon can work in watercolors. Shortly thereafter, Victoria, 18 years of age, becomes queen on the death of her uncle, William IV. As her first official act, Victoria prorogues or closes Parliament, and specifically the House of Lords. Chalon springs into action to record the event. Victoria sits to him in just 5 30-minute sessions over 3 weeks. 4 days after that, Chalon exhibits the watercolor at the Royal Academy to his peers. A contemporary artist, Leslie, reports that Chalon has made a splendid drawing, the Robes of State watercolor, of her, Victoria, whole length, in the Robes of State. 2 days later, the singular portrait is gifted by Victoria to her mother, the Duchess of Kent. Victoria writes, "I then gave Mama her presents, with which I am glad to say she was much pleased. I gave her my portrait, full length and in the robes, done in watercolors by A.E. Chalon, and very like and beautifully done." We note at this time the King of Portugal was Ferdinand II and was known as the Artist King. Okay, here we see a close-up of the image from the side, of the painting from the side. You know, we see that the substrate of the painting is some sort of wavy paper or paper-like material. We also see a zoom in of the gilt signature statement found at the bottom, A.E. Chalon R.A., and as John mentioned, portrait painter in watercolors to Her Majesty. 3 weeks after Chalon completes his portrait, he writes a letter. This letter was exhibited at the V&A many decades ago, then seems to have languished, but certainly it contains new information to me. We knew Chalon paints the painting and Cousins engraves it, but what we see here from John's photos, thanks John, is that Chalon, the famous watercolor artist of the day, is specifically championing Cousins, the famous engraver of the day, to engrave Victoria's portrait. The letter, which we sort of transcribe at the bottom right, refers to Cousins of Bolton Abbey. Cousins didn't own any land in Bolton Abbey. Rather, Cousins had recently done a fine job engraving Landseer's artwork of that name. Clearly, it had impressed Chalon and left a memory. Then, after Chalon's convalescence at Richmond, he starts another painting, just a miniature of Victoria's head only, based on the Robes of State portrait. He ends up finishing it in a rush. On December the 20th, Victoria sits twice to him. However, the whereabouts of this miniature, or if it even still exists, seems to be unknown. So recall Victoria sat twice to Chalon on December the 20th in 1837. We hypothesized that Chalon was racing to complete it and delivered this miniature within days, since we see on December 29th that Chalon was paid £288 and 15 shillings by the Privy Purse. But what was that payment exactly for? The earlier letter provides a tantalizing clue, because on the letter, we see a calculation in red overwritten by another calculation in black. The black calculation looks something like 127 plus 160 equals 287. Now, £287 and 288 odd pounds are not so far apart. So this might be for the price of the Robes of State portrait plus the miniature Chalon was about to start. And if so, the arithmetic is clearly for 2 items, not 3 paintings or 3 paintings plus the miniature. Or the calculations of something completely different. A month after the Duchess of Kent receives this singular painting, the business of printing artworks kicks in. Now, revenue there ultimately comes from selling many high-priced prints of the engraving after the painting. This revenue will pay for the copyright fee to Chalon, and success here, in terms of selling lots of prints, will mean greater copyright payments for Chalon's future artworks. And this all explains why Chalon championed Cousins to be the engraver. We see that Mr. Moon is the publisher, taking the business risk. And on the one hand, he pays 1,000 guineas to Chalon. And on the other hand, he needs to sell a lot of prints. First up, Moon shows the portrait to various London critics, whose reviews are later published in newspapers by Moon. In adverts, he talks up the portrait, this national first and only authentic full-length portrait. And he also cites the reviews. For instance, it was painted at the express command of the Queen, a charming union of queenly dignity and feminine delicacy and beauty, and so forth. In fact, this singular portrait is something of a celebrity, with its comings and goings tracked by the newspapers of the day. First, it's recorded that it goes to art dealers in Manchester and exhibited to 7,000 people there. Next, it's returned by principal, Mr. Grundy, for engraving by Cousins. Cousins had made major progress by January the next year, and so it's sent to Edinburgh for more demand generation. An early etching of Cousins was presented by Moon to Victoria, who was pleased to express herself highly gratified with the progress of the engraver. We see from the advert at the far right that the print cost around £7, £3 to £12, depending on when you buy it and how early it is. Okay, over to you, John.
Thank you. So the original portrait was famous in its day and clearly was copied by engravers and other artists at the time. So our research of auction catalogues and libraries of images on the internet have pulled up a number of copies, and here you see some of them. Who commissioned these items has been lost over time. William Warman, a contemporary of Chalon, signed his work, and here in the middle we have 3 of his copies. One resides in the Royal Collection and another is in private hands of a member of the Royal. At the right, we also have reference to 2 other portraits for which currently we have no photographic image. Note the fancy gilt frames of two of the portraits. These pictures clearly were displayed proudly in an important residence, consulate or embassy. Chalon went on to paint Victoria again in 1838, and in June of the same year, Victoria's coronation was held at Westminster Abbey, and at the time, Cousins' larger engraving from the portrait was published by F.G. Moon. These events all predated Victoria's marriage to Albert in 1840. In our research, we reached out to a royal archivist who had access to the original 1837 Privy Purse ledgers. He was unable to find any further payments to Chalon that would have support a hypothesis that Chalon himself produced a second or third copy of his portrait of the Queen in her robes of accession. Delia Miller, who wrote the Victorian watercolours and drawings in the collection of Her Majesty the Queen, states that after producing these portraits of Victoria's cousins in 1839, Chalon fell out of favour with the royal family. So at this point, we have to conclude there's no evidence from Victoria's journals or the Privy Purse ledgers that Chalon himself was commissioned by the Queen to produce more than one portrait. One could hypothesize, that Chalon was commissioned by somebody else. There are also theories about why a second or third portrait would have been gifted to the Prussian and Portuguese royal families at the time, but we found no supporting evidence to say that this happened. Brian, back over to you to discuss some of the key differences between the painted portraits of Victoria and the engravings done by Cousins and Humphreys.
Great, thanks, John. So in the 1840s, Humphreys prepares his first engraving of the Robes of State portrait for a banknote vignette for Perkins Bacon. A transfer of this is found on stamp, so let's call this the daughter, where Cousins' second engraving is like the mother of this engraving, and the Chalon painting is like the grandmother. Now, in this system, we're going to argue that the Portuguese Chalon is more like a great aunt, as follows. So from a cropping of the various pictures, we see some differences highlighted by the arrows in the middle picture. As the robes traverse Victoria's shoulder, we see a bulge, that topmost arrow, It's quite large and pronounced in the middle picture, cousin's second engraving, then less so in his first engraving, which is the inner left picture, but quite large again, more subtle but quite large in Chalon's original portrait. Now this bulge is equally pronounced in Humphrey's banknote engraving at inner right, but in the Portuguese Chalon at far right, there is no bulge. Similarly, the black ermine tails show lots of character in Chalon's portrait. There's small ones, large ones, triangular ones, P-shaped ones, and so forth. And this character is carried through Cousins and Humphrey's engravings. But in the Portuguese Chalon at far right, they're more homogenized and elliptical. Continuing with the history, by 1851, Victoria's mother gave the robes of state portrait to Albert. In 1851, Albert commissioned Buckley to paint another copy, which we'll henceforth call the Buckley copy, as a backup for the original, lest any accident should happen to the original during its display at the International Exhibition. We have a small version of that at top right. Next, Alfred's elder brother, John, dies. There's an exhibition of their works, one posthumously, one while alive, by Alfred, but unfortunately it attracted little attention, and Alfred's offer of, the brothers' work to Hampstead or the nation was unsuccessful. Not too far after that, Alfred dies, and a neighbour, and here we're indebted to Greg's research, a neighbour Ward, and what we'll call an almost executor of his will, acquired the sketch. It's unclear to us, at least, if it was gifted or he somehow took it post-mortem, but certainly that sketch then went into the possession of his daughter, Mrs. E.M. Ward, and that lasted until 1882. We'll see more of that next slide. But returning to the 1860s, after Alfred's death, his artwork is auctioned off. We were able to recover the catalogue of that auction. Now, the sketch is not listed, but the catalogue does report the breadth of media he, sometimes with fellow members of the Sketching Society, used. There's a whole bunch of different media, chalk, crayons, pen, bistre, charcoal, watercolors, of course, and oil. But what we don't see is any gouache on porcelain. There was a section on miniatures, and that was most likely just watercolor on ivory, especially since scores of blank ivories were auctioned too. Okay, now we're going to split the timeline. We're still tracing, the pretty well understood history of the British-Belgian Chalon on the left, and on the right, we're going to continue our investigation into the Portuguese thread, whereas, to try to establish, where the Portuguese Chalon would have been, and try to verify its existence. So in 1861, it's, bad year, Victoria's mother dies, then Albert dies, and presumably between 1861 and 1865, the robes of state portrait, the British-Belgian portrait, was transferred to the Belgian Royal Collection. We sort of make that inference given that Alfred was so careful of the portrait in 1851. We kind of assume that he held on to the painting until his death. And then later it's reported that it was transferred to King Leopold I, who died in 1865. Returning to the sketch, recall Mrs. Ward had possession of the sketch, and then from this sort of history on connected to the rear of the sketch, it's reported that it was gifted to the Duke of Albany in 1882 within the royal family. Another kind of curious data point, but probably not super important, as part of Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887, Victoria did wear the robes of state in public, and various European royalty were present, including the Prince and Princesses of Prussia and Portugal. Meanwhile, looking to the Portuguese history, King Ferdinand II, the artist king, was succeeded in turn by multiple royals. In 1886, there was this really important data point. The records of the paintings, furniture, and other objects held by Queen Maria II and Ferdinand II were catalogued. And they had a lot of paintings and so forth. There are 18 volumes, each 2,800 pages long, and each item is described by about 8 lines of handwritten Portuguese. And so finding an entry containing Chalon or Victoria or the Spanish version of Victoria is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And I regret to report that we stopped after just 0.1% of this effort, recognizing there's just no way we were ever reasonably going to get to that answer. And this is very disappointing. since finding an entry would independently confirm that there was indeed a Portuguese Chalon held by the Portuguese royal family, and it might shed light on when the painting was acquired, and if the painting was indeed understood by the Portuguese to be painted by Chalon himself or after Chalon. And so this remains the most tantalizing, important, yet incomplete line of inquiry. Okay, continuing the two threads. So on the left, Lowe reported that the British and Buckley Chalons were on view at the Royal Academy during the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. There are various records of paintings exhibited at the Royal. We were not able to find anything pertaining, relating to that in the newspapers of the day or the Royal Academy records. Now we start to see some philatelic histories here by Mottram and Joliffe. In each case, they refer to the portrait in the singular, a veritable portrait, the portrait, a painting. Now, obviously, these are many decades after the painting was originally painted, but certainly, the clear understanding of the philatelic community is that there was a single portrait. Meanwhile, King Manuel in 1910 has a tough time. He abdicates and departs for exile for England. Reportedly, he had just a day to evacuate. And so possibly, in the rush, he took that Portuguese Chalon, but certainly he continued to have support in Portugal. So it's also possible the painting could have been transferred later. What we learn from Lowe's record is that he sort of suggests that the painting was indeed transferred in 1910. He reports, the King of Portugal's copy came to this country when his successor, King Manuel, came in 1910. So continuing with the philatelic literature, Melville and actually also Whitney, which is more of an art historian, again, they refer to the portrait in the singular. But in 1922, referring to the sketch again, the Duke of Albany's widow, who outlasted her husband by quite some years, presumably held the sketch until her death in 1922, and then likely it made its way to the Harmer family auction firm, where it resided apparently until the 1990s, and that's where Greg saw it. Flipping to the Portuguese thread, Manuel II married Augusta Victoria of a European royal family, and they lived in a mansion on Fulwell Park in Twickenham. A really interesting data point that, again, probably is not very important, is actually in 1932, thieves broke in and they looted the property and they stole a bunch of artwork. Could they have stolen the Portuguese Chalon? Well, it's not recorded. Specifically, they did report a number of paintings that were stolen, and this is not listed among them. But certainly just a couple of months after that, Manuel dies. The couple had no children. So, to the extent they had a painting, it's not exactly clear what happens to it next, because the connection of the family with Britain dissipates. 2 years after her husband's death, Augusta leaves England and she moves to Switzerland. All Manuel's extensive collection of early Portuguese literature had been returned to Portugal, and Fulwell Park itself was converted in its entirety to a residential estate. So there's not much left in Britain by 1934, and it seems most likely that Augusta left England and never lived there again. For instance, after her stint in Switzerland, she married someone in Germany. Her husband died still in Germany in 1955, and Augusta later died in Germany in 1966. They had no children, so that sort of whole thread just dies away and connected, really staying in Germany. Meanwhile, jumping ahead to 1943 and 1946, we see that Lowe's knowledge of the Chalon portraits was really quite unremarkable. He refers to a single portrait in his works, Alfred E. Chalon, R.A., painted a portrait, the portrait of Queen Victoria, and so forth. However, everything changes in 1947. For the first time, he belatedly reports, in 1953, he reports that back in 1947, the copy, the Portuguese Chalon, was sold by auction, and I was fortunate enough to be the successful bidder. Now, we've been unable to identify a catalogue of this 1947 auction, nor any reports of the Portuguese Chalon in the early newspapers, although not all of them are digitized, so we don't claim perfection there. So we presume it would have been some sort of quiet private auction with invited-only bidders at an unknown location. Now, this seems kind of bad. For the first 100 years after the Chalon portrait was originally painted, there is no mention of the second and third portraits, not until really 1947, 1953. But at the same time, the sketch left few records too. So I think we keep an open mind at this stage. Over to you, John.
Thank you. So now we have the Portuguese Chalon in the ownership of Robson Lowe. And in 1953, we have Lowe writing in Stamp Collecting, a weekly journal, and presenting to the Royal Society of Arts in January of 1955, stating clearly that there were 3 copies of the portrait. He writes that the copies were given by Queen Victoria to the King of Prussia and the King of Portugal. And to be clear, we found no supporting evidence for this claim, which comes over 100 years after such a gift would have been made. Lowe's claim to own the Portuguese Chalon was fortuitous because at the time of writing, he didn't know the whereabouts of the original British-Belgian Chalon, and he reported that the Prussian Chalon had been destroyed by the RAF in World War II. There is, however, a very significant philatelic history associated and attached to Lowe's Portuguese Chalon. Here on the right, we see the portrait photographed in New Zealand prior to the opening of the 1955 Auckland International Stamp Exhibition. In transit, the gilt frame to the portrait was damaged. Remember, this is a portrait painted on porcelain and was incredibly heavy. The current frame is shown alongside the newspaper clipping, and you can see the frame has indeed changed. Here we see the timeline of the Portuguese Chalon up to 2009. In 1988, the New Zealand Post Office used an image of the Portuguese Chalon as the basis for their miniature sheet, celebrating the centenary of the Royal Philatelic Society of New Zealand. That society also used the same image for the dust jacket for volume 8 of their handbooks, the postage stamps of New Zealand. And then Bob Odenweller used the image as a frontispiece for his wonderful book on the Chalon stamps of New Zealand. Brian, back over to you for discussion on the analysis of some of the key differences between the Belgian, British Chalon and the Portuguese Chalon portraits.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so on the left, we see a close-in of the face of the Queen. The left one, British-Belgian Chalon, the right one is the Portuguese Chalon. And the left, well, in the right, sorry, we see that the eyes are more piercing and more directed upwards, where in the left picture, the eyes are larger and more directed to the Queen's right. The diadem cross patés and rows of pearls on the left are uniformly silver, or close to it, whereas alternately colored in gold on the right. And the earrings are more elliptical on the left and a more seashell spiral on the right. Now, the color of the drapes, we probably all noticed this, but in the background, the color of the drapes differed. And then as mentioned earlier, the bulge of the robes over the Queen's shoulder exists in the Chalon painting, but not in the Portuguese Chalon. Okay, and the inserts of the ermine's black winter tail differ as well. But we can also analyze other parts of this. The British-Belgian Chalon, as we've said, is watercolor over paper, and we've actually seen the paper from the side view. The Portuguese Chalon was gouache, so solid color over porcelain. The signature statement, was present in the British-Belgian Chalon, but nothing, not on the painting, not under the frame, not on the frame, did not have such a statement. The colors, we've seen there was some differences. The details, we've seen there were some differences. The dimensions were much the same. In terms of the brushstrokes, the art expert Maas reported that he'd seen many portraits after Chalon or from the studio of Chalon at sale or auction. He'd handled a couple of himself and had seen them at Christie's. However, he believed would never be able to prove provenance of the Portuguese Chalon. Clearly oils, the brushstroke is really embedded in the painting, whereas with watercolor, the colors, spread out. And so, the brushstroke is not really preserved there. So I think that's the basis of his comment there. In terms of the signature statement, Chalon was all over the map. Sometimes he identified his major works at bottom right or bottom and gilt, and we've seen an example of that, or outside the border or on the frame, and where it's unclear if there's anything under the frame. In terms of his major works, there was a miniature of the Duchess of Kent, and that has no visible signature, although possibly there might be something under the frame. So in general, we'd expect a gilt Chalon signature, but it's really hard to draw any strong conclusion from the apparent absence of such a signature on the Portuguese Chalon. Now, Greg, in a previous discussion, raised this idea. Did Chalon have a pattern of making duplicates? And honestly, we don't see Chalon making multiple versions of his works. For instance, there are no duplicates of any work of substance in the auction catalogue for his estate sale. Just very minor things like, in his academic studies and sketches, it mentions, 2 male figures, chalks, and there's 2 lots like that. However, they could be vastly different. Perhaps more ominous is the choice of substrate. Chalon was strongly associated with paper and somewhat with ivory. Among the 8 commentaries and about 800 artworks that we were able to search, we found no reference or instance of Chalon using porcelain as a substrate. And ditto with the medium, Chalon was most strongly associated with watercolors, and he dabbled in oils, particularly earlier in his career. And again, amongst all the work we found, we didn't find any use of gouache, except for the term touched with white. Essentially, when you're doing watercolor, you get that kind of translucent coloring. But if you do want a solid bright white, the paper of the time certainly wouldn't be bright white. So you would, he and others presumably would use gouache to provide that true white color. And certainly, again, provoked by a discussion with Greg, having a sort of a conceptual discussion, if Chalon were to make a very fine, gift-worthy version of his Robes of State portrait, it does seem like his natural choice would be to use watercolor, and failing watercolor, then oils. Gouache doesn't seem like a natural medium for him. And then, especially as John relays, in terms of the money trail, it's very weak. There is a record of 288 pounds 15 shillings by the Privy Purse for Chalon's Robe of State's painting, plus presumably the miniature, but no other Privy Purse payment was made to Chalon. There's also the private pictures account, but that's not appropriate for gifts to, foreign heads of state. So that seems a very unlikely route. Okay, over to you, John.
Thank you. So Lowe's account of 3 portraits by Chalon himself does not really seem to be supported by the evidence that Brian and I have gathered. All the references we have found to 3 portraits by Chalon can be traced back to Lowe himself. It is possible that Lowe's portrait was given to the Portuguese royal family and that the provenance or historical links have been lost. But even if that was the case, there still remains the significant doubt that Chalon painted it himself. Lowe's claim of a 3rd copy, the Prussian Chalon destroyed by the RAF in the war, is also not supported by any historical records that we could find. So the conclusion we've come to is that the evidence supports a single Chalon, the British-Belgian portrait. Every other copy has concerns relating to a lack of signature by Chalon, the medium in which they were painted, and we note Chalon really only worked in watercolors, and by the lack of money trail. Of course, we do not know what we do not know, or yet to find. So rely on others to comment, provide constructive criticism of our work, or to surface new information that will take the story forward with new insights. At this point, I would say everything that we have found we've documented in appendix to this presentation. Now, we're not going to present those here today, but they are available for anybody to follow our research and to use as they see fit. So with that, Mark, I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll take questions, I think.
Yes, thank you, John. Right. Now then, have we had any questions? Simon, we have so far had no questions raised in the chat.
Right. Okay.
That being the case, I think over to you at this point.
Right. Well, thank you very much. I think we're probably all just gobsmacked, actually, at the amount of diligence and research you've put in to investigating this story. Sad not to actually be able to come to a definitive conclusion, but just it's quite remarkable just how much you can still find out about these things all these years later. We're seeing an increase of importance and emphasis on provenance in philately. There are now various auction houses looking back at it, and I think this historical approach is going to grow and grow. Here we're applying it to a work of art, but it will equally apply to stamps. And you've done a tremendous job. We're all very grateful. Sad perhaps not to have an actual portrait at the Royal, but yes, without the provenance, I dare say the asking price was a bit steep. So we'll leave that one open. So thank you both. It's been very interesting. We do try to do something different with our December meeting. We've got the beach behind Brian to remind us of what we may have to look forward to in the new year. Mark, do you have certificates?
I do, but a late arriving question. What?
Right.
Shall we deal with the question first? Would that be all right?
Okay.
Yeah. Is that all
Yeah.
right? Is that all right with you, Simon? Mr. Harmon, Chris Harmon asks, John, is the die for the small oval engraving not held in the museum at the Royal?
Chris, I would have asked you that question. As more of an expert on what is in the Royal's collection than I am. I don't know. I do know we have an engraving or a print from the engraving held in the Royal's collection, but I don't know about that particular item.
Okay. Simon, that was the only question that's been raised.
Well, yes, I know Chris was quite closely involved with the project as well. So good. Right. And obviously our thanks to Ian for his contribution to this whole study. So perhaps if we share the screen, then people will we can do the presentation of the certificates and then open it up in case anybody wants to have a little bit more of an informal chat about.
Indeed. So I will indeed. You're quite right. We do have certificates to say thank you.
They're both there, and they look like they've been signed by the president.
They have indeed.
And John will probably collect his, and we'll post you yours, Brian.
Thank you.
I was able to hand over one in person after the last month's meeting, despite the presenter being from the United States. But we'll have to post this one to you. So thank you very much indeed on behalf of the president. It's been excellent.
Thank you, Simon. It was an interesting, fascinating activity to get involved with. It was no hard work.
Looks like quite a lot of hard work, but I'm glad it wasn't onerous.
It was fun. It was fun. And to be honest, it helped having Brian do some of the background work and I do the legwork. So I went to the V&A myself to photograph some of these items, and you know, it's a combination of things. And indeed, Brian was in Hawaii researching a portrait that was in one of the royal palaces in Hawaii. It turned out to be printing from the engraving, but it was described as a portrait.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So certainly in general, what we can do today just would not have been practically possible 20, 40 years ago. So much is digitized, so much is on the web. It's no real surprise that we're able to discover some new things. For instance, Chalon's catalog. There's probably of the posthumous auction. There's probably one copy of that in the world that happens to be in the French National Library. Discovering that 20, 40 years ago would be, really finding a needle in a haystack.
Yeah. And Victoria's journals weren't digitized. They're available to anybody to look through.
Yeah. We've had a couple more questions come in, gentlemen, which I'm sure you'd like to answer. Stephen Parkin asks, do we know if the same die was used for both the New Zealand and North American Chalon portrait stamps?
North America, there was actually a bunch of different printers, and some of them is a hard no. I think there's the province of Nova Scotia, so kind of North, Canada, really, and also the Bank of North America. Bank of British North America. Both of those came from Perkins Bacon's, and very likely was a transfer of the original banknote die. But there's many others, like say Farmers Bank and so on and so forth, that are just independent efforts. Also, some of the province of Nova Scotia stamps was by Perkins Bacon, and very likely is derived from that original die, one way or another.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to mention another question that came in. John, you and Brian, you'll find this slightly amusing. Matthew Blaine says that he's currently working on his New Zealand stamps, and he's obviously found your presentation was excellent. But then he asked the question, does the New Zealand British Study Group have an internet web page? John?
Yes, the society in the UK, well, it's worldwide, but it's the New Zealand Society of Great Britain. It doesn't have the word philatelic in it, which it should do, but that's not my problem. So the New Zealand Society of Great Britain, do a search on that, you'll find our website.
Okay. Smashing.
Thank you for that plug, Mark.
Thank you. And thank you for your question there, Matt. A couple more comments, Simon, and then I think, as you're right, we'll then open it up for general discussion. Glenn Minchell says, might the progress of AI allow a search of that Portuguese inventory that you've mentioned in your presentation?
That is a good question. I did attempt to use that using the tools available to me, and the results were disappointing. Essentially, it's handwriting on lines. So I take that, I digitize it. Well, it's actually already digitized, and did a web search. What's a good way to digitize handwriting? They recommend some Google tools. So I put it in there, asked Google to do the translation, or transcribing. And what I get is, like E, agraph 1, just, some random characters that had, that was like 1% of what was on the page. So that was a failed effort. I also got a more sort of traditional application and again ran it on the data, and again achieved nothing useful whatsoever. So I think, having said that, if I had a very powerful AI and I, got 10 pages and trained it on this, I'm sure we could do a way better job. The other thought is the so-called mechanical Turk, where you test, 50 people, how good they are at, transcribing, handwriting, and then, fire the whole, 18 volumes, 100 pages at, 150 different people, and, pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And at the end of that, especially if you get 2 or 3 people to do the same page, you probably have a good answer. So you could sell it. I've thought about this, but there's, that would probably cost as much as what they're asking for the portrait to complete that exercise.
Yeah, that's great. Now, Simon, our friend Ian Gregg would like to say something. Ian?
Yes, thank you. I think one thing that is quite important is linking the provenance of the sketch from Chalon to Mrs. Ward. It was briefly outlined. According to the Wards, and Mrs. Ward actually wrote a very long and complicated and not particularly well structured book, which I'm sure our two colleagues have struggled through like I did. Mrs. Ward's father, very complicated. Mrs. Ward's father, because Mrs. Ward also married a Ward, so her husband was called Ward, and she was sometimes called Mrs. Ward Ward, just to make things even more complicated. But clearly, Mr. Ward's father was to be trustee for the Chalon will. But Chalon refused to sign his will because he thought it would hasten his death, and the inevitable happened and he died without signing it, and hence all his intentions of giving the artwork to the nation failed, and it was actually inherited, I think, by a distant cousin. But clearly I suspect the government or whoever appointed Mr. Ward to act as determining what should happen to, as he was intended to be to control the will, and I think probably Mrs. Ward actually found the painting or the sketch in papers that were left, because the person who inherited all of Chalon's works lived in Switzerland, and as she says, he found it very difficult to get over to England to sort anything out. So I think the link there is quite strong.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Len Stanway has a question for Brian and John. Len observed that the Portuguese portrait seemed far less lifelike, and he wondered whether this was attributable to the different medium.
You're asking us. I don't think either of us would claim to be artists, so certainly I wouldn't. What you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. Sure, yeah.
Okay. Well,
can I just add? Sorry, can I just quickly say, I had not seen the two portraits, the finished portraits together. The one on porcelain, I think the perspective is very poor compared to the other one, which I think is a very interesting thing to look at. Look at the perspective on the columns and things, and it's completely out on the one on porcelain. It's just not correct at all.
Right.
And I thought the difference would be as much to do with what it's being painted on, like on porcelain, as to do with the medium, the watercolor or oils.
And one thing we didn't raise is, the porcelain was unfired, but a lot of the times in the day, you would fire it and it would have maybe greater longevity. Being so large and rectangular, maybe they deliberately didn't fire it because it might have cracked. But on the other hand, they might have thought about firing it, or the person doing it may have, been used to working with porcelain where it was fired. And then, the paints that you can use when intended to be fired just aren't the same as the paints, the traditional oils and so forth that you would use. And I think that's one reason, for instance, why the color of the drapes may have changed, just because of the constraints of the medium.
Oh, right.
And then that may have affected, the whole choice of many things. Now that's just speculation. We don't have any evidence, but it seems not implausible.
Okay.
And that's the second firing, isn't it? Because of course the porcelain base would have already been fired before it was painted on. Yeah.
Yeah. Chris Harmon would like to make a comment. Chris.
Yeah. Isn't the porcelain one? Isn't it convex? It's not flat, is it? It's like a bowl. It's painted on the outside of the bowl, isn't it? That's normally what they did with these porcelain. I mean, I've got a couple of them, which are all very heavy, and it's not a flat thing. Yeah, I may be wrong on this one, but I'd always assumed it was convex.
Maybe slightly.
You've actually handled it, have you, or seen it?
I have not seen it. I've just seen many photographs of it,
and it doesn't show like that. Okay. The only other point I wanted to make is of course the the Coronation Robes portrait, which is what we're talking about here, which is New Zealand and Penny, Nova Scotia. The other Chalon portrait has a completely different history. The ones used for Van Diemen's Land and Natal, Queensland, etc. That was from a little watercolor by Edward Henry Corbould, which is actually in the Queen's collection. So we do call two completely unrelated portraits Chalon portraits, one of which actually comes from a Chalon portrait, and the other one is a Corbould portrait, like Chalon's.
That's definitely worth mentioning. Yeah, two different engravings, stamp engravings with two different sets of stamps. We could make the argument that Corbould's miniature was intended to be kind of a somewhat after the Robes of State portrait. You know, the sash is common, but yeah, there's definitely a step in the middle for sure, and arguably a decoupling. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Simon, I think, would you agree that we've reached the end of the formal part of the meeting?
Indeed. And yes, so thank you once again to everybody for participating and for the remarkable amount of work that John and Brian, supported by one or two others, have done. So big thanks. And we'll look forward to seeing you all at our January Zoom on the empires in India, or lack of them.